Living blades are powerful magical weapons that you might find being wielded by broodmasters of the Nephilim. Long ago, during the Tyrant War, Fey artificers created metal weapons infused with blood that gave the Nephilim who wielded them the power to use old ether magic. Wielding these living blades gave the Nephilim a leg up in the Tyrant War, and their users soon became powerful leaders among the Nephilim. But when the war finally ended, these blades were so sought after that they created infighting, as everyone wanted one of these powerful weapons. When the Black Blood ritual was performed, it affected the blood inside the living blades as well, and destroyed their ability to harness the old magic. The blades developed a taste for dominance and power, and though their ability to change their shape was reduced, the blades would still choose powerful Nephilim to be their wielders, elevating the individual to the status of broodmaster. Though few of the living blades are still around, possession of one is still a powerful status symbol among the Nephilim, and should any more be found, it will certainly cause a power struggle, with new leaders trying to assert their dominance. Lorelei, mother of Nekima and Lilith, once wielded a living blade, until she was struck down in a duel against another broodmaster, Ethrir. Her daughter Nekima took up her sword, and cut down Ethrir in a rage. Everyone was surprised to find that Nekima was able to wield the blade, having not already been chosen by it, and this elevated her to the status of broodmother. She decided to rename the weapon in honor of her mother, and it's known as Lorelei to this day. Her sister Lilith wields the living blade Alreun, and it's currently trapped with her inside of Nythera. The ancient broodmaster Castor was slumbering alongside his living blade Marathine, and both have recently been reawakened. The Sycorax of the Aedicithae wields the living blade Idgis, and Ithana lurks in the western Knotwoods with her blade Desmonia. Two other living blades are known about, Kelival and Yvonne, but their locations are currently unknown. If you saw my recent video about relic hammers, then you might remember that throughout the years, the appearance of the relic hammers has actually changed pretty significantly. The interesting thing about the living blades is that actually makes sense in the lore. They have the ability to transform, and we even know that part of the reason Lorelei was defeated was because her opponent's living blade was able to form serrations that he used to trap her blade. The first example of a living blade that we have is Lilith from 1st edition, and we can see here that it's kind of a big, chunky, two-handed sword. Pretty impractical, a human probably wouldn't be able to even lift this, but it's pretty cool looking anyway. When we get to 2nd edition, the blade changes a little bit, but it more or less keeps the same overall shape. Now, an interesting thing here is that there was an alternative model for Lilith in 1st edition that looked like this, and she carried this scythe-looking weapon. Now, I don't know if that's supposed to be her living blade, or if this is even canon, but it'd be pretty cool if the living blades could actually transform into other kinds of weapons. Now, Nekima, on the other hand, actually has a ton of different examples for her blade. Her 1st edition model, she carried this big, giant, greatsword-looking thing, and by 2nd edition, again, it kind of changed shape slightly, but still had the same overall look and feel. She also had an alt model in 2nd edition, and the blade from that one actually looks like it's almost the same as the blade that she's carrying in the 3rd edition sculpt. The shape is basically exactly the same. Now, an interesting thing about Nekima is that her title version, Broodmother, doesn't even use the living blade as a weapon in the game, but interestingly, the title sculpt, the sword is actually slimmed down a little bit and it actually looks a little bit more like Lilith's sword. I don't know if that's something they did intentionally, seeing as she's sort of taken Lilith's place, but an interesting detail nonetheless. And then the last living blade that we've actually seen is Marathine. Now, this is Castor's living blade, and the weird thing here, of course, is that Marathine is its own model. It's a really cool idea, and we can see here that the blade is a little bit simpler looking than the other living blades we've seen, but it's got this kind of jagged, nasty looking edge, which is kind of cool, and I think it suits Castor pretty well. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the rules for the living blades. Now, the relic hammers have some pretty consistent rules throughout the game. They've changed a bit each edition, but more or less in any one edition, all the relic hammers work pretty much the same way, with some very minor deviation. On the other hand, the living blades are totally different. An interesting note is that early on they were just called greatswords. We can see here that in 1st edition, Nekima's greatsword was actually a 3-inch melee as opposed to a 2-inch melee on Lilith's. Otherwise, they were pretty similar. They both had positive twists on damage, and ways that they could build in suits so they could get triggers, although Nekima had a lot more triggers available. By 2nd edition, they actually diverged a little bit more. We can see that not only does Nekima have an extra inch on her melee range, but she's also got a higher damage track. The built-in suits is still a thing, and some of the triggers have even carried over. An interesting note is that this is the first time that we see one of the living blades referred to by its name, in the form of Lorelei on Nekima's card. On the other hand, Lilith's greatsword is actually the same stat line as you see on other models in 2nd edition. For example, the greatsword that Lady Justice carries is exactly the same stat line, just with a different trigger. This is interesting because it suggests that at the time they weren't thinking of Lilith's blade as something special along the lines of Nekima's. And then once we get to 3rd edition, Lilith still gets disrespected and doesn't get a name for her sword, it's just greatsword again, though the ranges are the same and the damage tracks are much closer. Plus there's more overlap in the triggers. So the power levels are a little bit more similar, but on the other hand, Lilith's greatsword feels a little bit more generic because there's actually a handful of models in 3rd edition that have a greatsword that's almost exactly the same. And then again, we can see here that Nekima's title version doesn't even get access to her sword. She's got a melee attack, but it's called Vital Strike, and it's obviously nothing like the sword attack that she has in her original version. And then last here we have the Odd Man Out Marathon. Its rules are completely different from the other living blades, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's a totem and it works independently and isn't even carried by Castor, which is interesting. It's got a much lower damage track. On the other hand, it can't be killed, so that's pretty cool. Another interesting similarity between the Relic Hammers and the Living Blades are that they were both created to fight the Tyrants. But while the Relic Hammers have actually had special unique abilities at different times that show that they were Tyrant fighting weapons, the Living Blades don't really have anything like that. Now maybe that's because they lost a lot of their power after the Black Blood ritual, but it would be cool to see some of that incorporated back into their rules, or some other magical property that indicates that they're something other than just a typical big sword. Another interesting note is that while the Relic Hammers and the Living Blades were all created thousands of years ago, somehow many of the Relic Hammers have actually ended up in the hands of humans. In fact, until the recent release of Parson, we've only seen Relic Hammers in the hands of humans. On the other hand, the Living Blades we've only seen being used by Neverborn, and maybe that's because the weapons actually have to choose their wielders. Though it is interesting that there's only 13 Relic Hammers, and so many of them have ended up in the hands of humans. We don't know how many Living Blades there are. Presumably back in the day there were many more, and I'll be curious to see if there's ever any chance that one chooses a human as its wielder, or anyone who's not a Neverborn. Maybe Zoraida will give it a shot one day. So that's everything we know about the Living Blades. Let me know what you think about them, and let me know if you think we're going to see more Living Blades added to the game down the line. Also, if Lilith ever comes back, do you think her sword is ever actually going to get its proper name, Alraun, or is it just going to be called Greatsword again? Justice for Lilith. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, check out the Discord, the affiliate link, and the Patreon. And huge thanks to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, and Biclops Gladiator Games. Thanks for watching.